This is the paper 1, May, June 2022, paper 1, version 2, or paper 12 for AICE Marine Science. All right, in your first question, you're looking at 5 different substances, and you have to classify them as ionic or covalent. And I just attached, just for this question specifically, the syllabus for this, so you can see where this is coming from. And it's going to be in 1.15, additionally 1.17 and 1.18. And so identify, including from a diagram, your covalent molecules: water, CO2, oxygen, sulfur dioxide, and glucose. And identify from diagrams ionic substances: sodium chloride and calcium carbonate. But because it's also a salt, magnesium sulfate can also be included in that as well, because you do have to be able to state the chemical name and or formula of salts found in the water. All right, and so for your first one, and that's just a quick flashcard review, honestly. I'll lock the screen. All right. Your ionics are going to be the calcium carbonate. Calcium is a metal, carbonate's a nonmetal. Sodium chloride. Sodium is a metal, and chlorine is a nonmetal. I'm going to use their chemical formula. And so the remaining carbon dioxide is covalent. Carbon and oxygen are nonmetals. Glucose, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, nonmetals. And then oxygen, nonmetal, also covalent. And you can write the names out, or you could do their formula. And again, other ones that are in the covalent but are not included in that list would be sulfur dioxide and magnesium sulfate. Water is a covalent molecule, so they share electrons, just not equally. And there's hydrogen bonding between the molecules. 4 marks. Explain so why and how hydrogen bonds are formed. So this is actually just going to be like the October-November paper 11 video that I did. The answer is not going to change. You're welcome to do diagrams on the exam. And in class, I never prefer to answer these questions without a diagram. You may see that some of the marks are not identical to what they are in each different mark scheme, but you do have sometimes different exam writers writing them. Okay, oxygen can hold 8 valence electrons in its outer shell, so it has a partial negative charge. Hydrogen has 1 valence electron, but needs 1 more to have a stable outer shell, or a full outer shell. And so that's going to make it partially positive in comparison to the oxygen. So what we just wrote then, what we just drew, we'll write. Essentially, this question is saying, why does water bond with itself? So I'm going to start with just that one water molecule. The oxygen atom, it's not an ion. Ions form when an electron is lost or taken. So partially negative, or you can use this symbol, and that's actually what I'm going to use. It's a little bit easier, a lot bit easier. Hydrogen atom has a partial positive charge. And then here's your explains. This is like the why. Due to oxygen attracting more electrons. And you're welcome to also refer to that as like electron affinity, if that's something you're familiar with from chemistry. Okay, I'm going to draw my second, actually, I'm going to cheat with my second water molecule. Okay. And so the hydrogen bond will actually form right here. That could be one. And I'll throw on another. Another would form right here. And so if you notice what's going on, it's because you have the partially negative oxygen atom is attracting itself to the partially positive hydrogen atom of another water molecule. And in the middle and the bottom one, the partially negative oxygen atom is attracted to the partially positive hydrogen atom of another water molecule. But these are weaker bonds, the hydrogen bond, and that's evident in that it doesn't like destroy the water molecule. It doesn't, for example, the one in the middle isn't like pulling this one off to it. That's not what's happening. It's still staying in its water molecule. It's not being pulled away, but they are just attracted to themselves. Okay. Oop. The partially positive hydrogen atom, and you can start this either way. You could talk about it with oxygen first or hydrogen first, doesn't matter. Partially positive hydrogen atom is attracted to the partially negative oxygen atom of another water molecule. Come on, eraser. Due to electrostatic forces, which also means that opposite charges attract. And on Monday, do not write, or on the day of your paper one, which this year it's Monday, do not put OPP. And the last thing, and just like I mentioned, why they're not like breaking these water molecules apart, they're not stealing those atoms away, they're just attracted to them, is that hydrogen bonds are weaker than covalent bonds. Okay, next question. Oops, all right, excuse me. Explain the role of hydrogen bonding in the dissolving of sodium chloride in water. Sodium chloride is really the only salt that you need to know in terms of its dissolution in water. So explain the role, how, essentially, hydrogen bonding, dissolving sodium chloride in water. So if you know this answer from the specimen paper, and I believe there was even one in the May-June paper 11, this answer isn't really going to change. Initially, when I looked at it, I was like, well, how is this different than saying, describe how sodium chloride dissolves in water? How is explain the role of hydrogen bonding going to be any different? And it's not. It is going to be that same type of answer. And so first I'm going to just remind you of why sodium chloride has its charges initially. And so this might be a little bit of a challenge because you're not going to be given a periodic table. You just need throughout the year, you need to have had knowledge of this question. And specifically, you would need to know like the properties of the periodic table, how many valence electrons an atom has, and then how many more it's going to need to have a full outer shell. And that's going to be for hydrogen, oxygen, sodium, and chlorine. So we need to first see the charges on salt. Okay, sodium is in group 1 of the periodic table, which means it has 1 valence electron. Chlorine has 7 valence electrons. It's in group 7 of the periodic table, and the groups or the columns that they're in tell you. Well, sodium, in order to be stable, needs 8 electrons. That's the octet rule in its outer shell. So sodium's either going to have to find 7 electrons or get rid of 1. It's much easier to get rid of 1. If it gets rid of 1, then its next shell down will be full, and then it's a happy sodium. Chlorine has 7 electrons in its outer shell, and it requires 1 more. And so it's either going to lose those 7, which it won't, or it'll bond with an atom that wants to give 1 more. And so that's exactly what happens. And this is why group 1s and group 7s bond so well together, because 1 plus 7 is 8. And that's the octet rule. If you want to keep yourself from getting caught up in saying the octet rule, maybe in a time when you need to talk about hydrogen, just say the phrase full outer shells. They want to have a full outer shell. Hydrogen is the only one in the syllabus that cannot have 8 valence electrons. It can only hold 2 in its shell. It only has that one shell. All right, so sodium gave away 1 negative thing. And so now gave away 1 negative thing. It's going to have a +1 charge. Chlorine now becomes chloride because it's an ion now that it took an electron and it took on 1 negative thing. It's going to have a -1 charge because it took 1. That ends up looking like this. Na plus Cl minus. But for diagram's sake, I prefer to draw it like this. Na, and then a Cl plus, and it's going to have a minus. And I don't know how scientifically correct to draw that as a salt is, but I'm totally fine with it. Let me bring back in my water molecule. It's so cool I can do that. And I'll make this area small. Oh, dang. Jeez. I'm going to try one more time. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Well, it's not meant to be. The way that I have this water, and I want to turn it. Why? But why? For real, why? I'm sorry. I'm sure if you skip ahead 10 seconds, I'll probably figure my situation out. Okay. I actually want it here. Sorry, this is upside down. Get this one out of the way. Dang. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. My gosh. Okay. Is it because I bragged about how cool this was? I deserve it. Okay. Oh, notice that the partially positive hydrogen atom of the water molecule is, in the way that I arranged it, would attract itself to the negatively charged chloride ion. Same rationality is because opposite charges will attract each other. And likewise, on the partially negative oxygen atom, it would attract itself to the positively charged sodium ion of the salt molecule. And that's because opposite charges attract. And then that will start the dissolution process. Water, if the temperature increases, water will literally bombard into the salt compounds more often, and it'll cause this dissolution process to happen quicker. All right, and so you can talk about this again in terms of, you can introduce chloride ion first, or you can talk about the sodium ion first. Notice when you're talking about chlorine becoming an ion, it does become chloride. Okay, the chloride ion has a negative charge. Or you can say the reverse argument, ORA, or the reverse argument, you could say the sodium ion has a positive charge due to gaining an electron from the Na, or you can say sodium ion. Again, or the reverse argument, you could say in the beginning, the sodium ion has a positive charge due to losing an electron to the chloride ion. And if this is overwhelming, just know that it's only sodium chloride that you need to know this for. And then again, the water molecule, its charges. All right, the chloride ion, Cl minus ion, and that's appropriate to write it like that as well, is attracted to the partially positive hydrogen. You could write the whole thing out, or you can put H. Atom. It's an atom because hydrogen and oxygen form the covalent bond. Ions are when there are giving and taking electrons, forcing them to have a different charge. Or you could do the reverse argument here. Sodium ion is attracted, the positive sodium ion is attracted to the partially negative oxygen atom. Okay, and this separates the lattice structure. Salts do form a lattice structure like this, like a crystal-like structure. Or you can say this separates the ionic bonds of NaCl. All right. Like that color. State 2 elements that are found in all carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. So we're looking for the ones that they have in common. First of all, an easy one, they all have carbon. Here's CHO, a little bit of O, chons. So they all have carbon in common, and that's why it's like a molecule for life. Lipid. Oh, my bad. I'm sorry. I held a 4-hour review today. Carbon, hydrogen, and then oxygen. This is a fun one. So draw connecting lines. The large molecule, a small molecule from which it's made. This is again the monomer polymer situation, similar to the other video. You could have more than one. And even though they put that in bold, and even though I'll say it in class, there's still times when you're like, wait, this seems weird. So it is appropriate. Cellulose is made from glucose. So is starch. Starch is a storage molecule. Lipids are made of glycerol and fatty acids. It's a crazy line. And then proteins are made from amino acids. So you get a mark for having each one correct. Outline how seagrasses make carbohydrates. This is actually a simple one to fix that my students were unsure of. They were unsure of how seagrasses would make a carbohydrate differently than any other organism. Also confusing about carbohydrates. So a lot of this is just background knowledge that you should have learned in biology. And unfortunately, a lot of my students learned biology, or learned in quotes biology, online during COVID, and there wasn't much learning then. So you're really only as strong as your previous biology teacher, and no shade on my students at all. That's just the reality. So to fix this, if you look at glucose, consider its formula. We know this is something that a plant makes. It's C6H12O6. And check this out. So here is your carbohydrate. C for the car, O, oxygen for the bow, and then hydrate, the hydrogen, carbohydrate. Glucose is a carbohydrate. So this question is essentially saying outline how any plant does photosynthesis, period. Period. That's it. Outline just means you need to answer. It's not like a list. It's like a sentence list. So this question could easily say outline, why am I doing that? Outline how kelp makes carbohydrates, outline how seagrasses obviously make carbohydrates, outline how diatoms make carbohydrates, how dinoflagellates make carbohydrates, because those are all phytoplanktons. Outline how zooxanthellae makes carbohydrates. So seagrasses do photosynthesis. Seagrasses do photosynthesis. Don't just put photo. Photo means light, does not mean synthesizing glucose or carbohydrates or organic material. Okay, and they use light energy. Or sun light energy. NRG, energy. And then I won't do it now, but in class, I tried to make this pretty simple by doing this to the cha-cha slide. And it was extremely brief, but all we needed to think about was what plants do. So they use light energy to convert CO2 and water. And you can write those out, you can put their formula into, they release oxygen, that's a waste product in photosynthesis, but the goal is to synthesize glucose. Now, if this question talked about how seagrasses make carbohydrates for insert trophic level, whatever, for trophic levels, for the food web, and there's a food web pictured with it, you definitely want to end this statement then with for higher trophic levels or for organisms in the trophic level. But there is no indicator here. There's not a picture above it talking about that. So there's no indicator here to reference that they're a producer in like a community situation. This is just straight up, how does a plant do photosynthesis? All right, watch out for this one. I would have missed it if I hadn't seen that bracket. So there's a question. It's not just a statement. Map of the world showing the oceans. Label the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean. All right, so I'll show you where the Atlantic Ocean needs to be within this range. So all the way down here, the tip of Patagonia. Okay, and then right there. So here you can put the Atlantic Ocean. You can do a line, connects it, Atlantic. So you wouldn't necessarily color it in. You're not going to have any colors. That's not what they, it's not proper testing to use color on it. But you don't necessarily have to do its boundary. You just need to label one area, like within this boundary that I just did. The Indian Ocean follows this similar pattern, hits the west side of Australia, all through Indonesia and India, Middle East, and then Africa and Madagascar. And so anywhere within this pink area, you would have the Indian Ocean. Arctic is up here. Obviously Pacific within this area, and Pacific over here. Down here, Southern Ocean. It's weird. Okay. There's a spring tide at X on figure 2.1. Here is X. Looks like it's Argentina. Argentina, Venezuela. Explain how spring tide at X is formed. Don't let this confuse you. This question is asking, how does a spring tide form? This X could have been any coastal area. It doesn't have to be right there. So this question is essentially asking about how a spring tide forms. So this is something you could use a diagram for, certainly. And Earth, little baby moon, and a sun. And gravity is going to be pulling this way. And then we also have gravity pulling this way from the sun. So pulling Earth towards it. And when that happens, it's going to pull on Earth's water, like the water that's facing it, creating a tidal bulge. And it pulls on Earth itself. And so Earth itself kind of gets pulled away from its location. And where Earth previously was, there's no gravity pulling on the other side of Earth. And so it's almost like it leaves its water behind on the left side because there is no gravitational pull over there. What's happening is that the moon and the sun are working in conjunction together, and they're both pulling on Earth in this direction. So towards the right of my page. And they're working, if you think of this as like a tug of war, they're working on the same team. And so their gravitational forces kind of add to each other. So the moon plus the sun pulling, they're going to pull very strong. Now you'll also have a spring tide if maybe the sun is over here, but you're not going to have the same result. You'll have the moon pulling towards the right, and then the sun will pull towards the left. The moon has a greater gravitational pull because it's closer, despite how close I drew the sun. My bad. But they're not going to be additive forces. They're not going to be working together and pulling within the same direction. You're still going to have a spring tide, but it just won't be as great as the granddaddy spring tide over here on the left, on the right side. I'm going to get rid of those. All right, so this doesn't have anything to do with South America. The spring tide is going to be the same. So we need to say what's going on here. They're not at 90 degrees from each other. That would be more of like a neap tide scenario. And they pull in opposite directions. That's not what's happening. So we need to state what their alignment is like. And so the Earth, Moon, and Sun are in a straight line or 180 degrees of each other. And I'm going to put EMS instead of Earth, Moon, and Sun on Monday or whenever you're taking paper one. You're going to write out Earth, Moon, and Sun. All right, if you haven't watched any of my other videos, the slash means you could say this or you could say that. It's within the same mark. The gravitational force the moon and sun. So this mark right here is essentially the fact that you're mentioning that it's gravity. They're working together or they're like additive. They're pulling on Earth's water and on Earth. They're pulling in the same direction. And like I said, if the sun was on the other side, you would still get a spring tide, but it's just they're not going to be playing on the same tug of war team, if you will. And at any time you can mention this, spring tides have the highest tidal range. Tidal range, it's the difference between the high tide height and the low tide height. And then last thing we can just say is what I just drew. Oops. This would be during a new moon. A new moon. When the moon and sun are on the same side their gravity is the strongest force on the ocean or the body of water. Okay. Air pressure. The air pressure at X increases between a high tide and a low tide. And again, the area X really doesn't make any difference. State, so just give an answer and give a reason, explain the difference between the predicted and the actual height of the low tide. So state what you think the difference will be and give a reason for why you think that is. And that's how you can get 2 marks, from the statement being correct and then your reason being correct. The predicted would just be, we can predict this because we know lunar phases. But then the actual is going to be based on weather. So a way to see this is if this is like your shoreline. And this is like predicted. This is what we think it's going to be, the tide height, the low tide height. And then air pressure increases. So just in the atmosphere, now we have even more of a force of the air pushing down on the water, pushing down, pushing down, pushing down. What's actually going to happen is that the low tide is lower, the actual. And so the statement is the low tide will be lower, and then your reason, air pressure pushes down on the water more, or air pressure pushes water down, something like that. I like that Rocky Shore question. Okay. Let me get to the big ones. All right. Question 3. A symbiotic relationship has recently been discovered between a photosynthetic marine algae, and a bacterium that only lives in the algae. It would be a good thing to draw this out. So you have the algae, throw in some chloroplasts, and then you have a bacteria that only lives inside of the algae. I'll give it a little cilia and some things on the inside. Great. The bacteria uses 20% of their own energy production to make a toxin. The toxin is not harmful to the algae, but it is toxic to organisms that eat the algae. So I'm just going to be assuming that this will cause the algae to be eaten less because it's toxic, and organisms will pass that word around essentially, and they won't be consuming that algae. The bacteria will have like protection living inside of the algae, and the bacteria won't have to be consuming a lot or making their own energy. It's not like they're decomposing the algae species, or they wouldn't be living in there. So the algae is also going to get some organic material or glucose or nutrients or a food source from the algae species. And all of those things, the fact that they're working together will allow their populations to get bigger and avoid predation. So this is a symbiotic relationship in which both organisms will be helping each other or both benefit from this. So it suggests the type of symbiotic relationship. This would be mutualism. All right, suggest, so give a reason, or give an answer and explain, give reasons for your answer. The effect of this relationship on the algae and on the bacterium, 4 marks. Focus on the and so that you can split your answers apart and see where you can get marks from. Both, especially mutualism, you definitely want to use that word, both. Organisms benefit each other. All right, and so we can start talking about what the toxin or what the bacteria is going to do and its toxin. The toxin, and this is from the bacteria. Protects the algae. It's not that it just protects the it's not that it just protects the bacteria. We need to talk about this in terms of it being mutualistic and them benefiting each other. So obviously the toxin is going to protect the bacteria or it would die from it, but it will protect the symbiont that it lives inside. And this will allow the algae population to increase. I'm going to put pop, not population. Don't put that on Monday. And don't use arrows on Monday. All right, bacteria, it's a living organism. It does cellular respiration. And so it's going to use oxygen in a food source to synthesize ATP in its mitochondria. Even though it's a bacteria, it still has to do respiration. Everything that's alive has to do respiration. And so it's going to excrete as a waste product carbon dioxide in the algae. It's an algae, so it does photosynthesis. It needs carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis. So that will be something that the algae is going to get from the bacteria. Algae receives or gets CO2 from the bacteria. Okay, and now where the bacteria is going to benefit. The bacteria gets protection living inside of the algae. Or like an environment from the algae. The bacteria gets nutrients or a source of energy, the glucose that the algae is going to make. And back to what I said about respiration. Again, bacteria are an organism, so they have to do respiration. They need oxygen. The algae does photosynthesis, and so it's going to release oxygen. And then it's a good thing to link together if you're talking about something getting oxygen or the use of oxygen or something needs oxygen, organisms need oxygen, link oxygen with respiration. All right, one of the toxins produced by the bacterium is being investigated as a potential anti-cancer drug. State the name of one other medical product that has been sourced from marine organisms. Now, there's a whole list of this, and I didn't write the entire list, but I do recommend for my students to at least have one go-to. Having one go-to is a great idea because then you can get those small marks like this and bigger marks if there's a question about talking about how humans benefit, explain how humans benefit from coral reefs or marine biodiversity. So one of them straight from your syllabus is hemocyanin. Or you could reference the KHL, which stands for the key whole limpet. So it is a mollusk, and they do extract, by say they, like scientists, will extract hemocyanin from it. A marine cone snail, and that would be, I believe it is for cancer treatment. And real quick, I'll show you on the syllabus. If you go to 4.3, which is biodiversity, then you can see here. A source of medicines, and this was marine biodiversity and the services that it provides, the importance for it. Source of medicines, anti-cancer drugs such as the keyhole limpet hemocyanin. Oh, and I was very extra in the way that I wrote hemocyanin. Now there's a whole bunch. There's medicine for arthritis, medicine for schizophrenia, medicine for Alzheimer's, potential vaccines against certain things. There's like pain relief. There's so many, and it's all in 4.3. Yay. All right, I like this question a lot. This is 5.3 or 4. 5.3 maybe? 5.3, rocky shores. As the tide goes out on a rocky shore, rock pools from where the seawater does not drain away will start to form. Scientists monitor the water temperature in several rock pools in the littoral or intertidal zone over one tidal cycle. So tidal cycle is from one high tide to a low tide. The rock pools are located at different heights above the low tide level. And in your textbook, and then if you're my student in class, you guys wrote that no matter what zone you're in the rocky shore, rock pools can exist there. You're looking at the average or the mean temperatures of the rock pools in each region. Okay, and so just to give you a visual, that will be our rocky shore. Upper shore, middle shore, and lower shore. And just depending on what the organisms are adapted to and how much they can avoid desiccation and predation, they will put themselves in certain areas, and that's called zonation. And the biggest resource that organisms compete over here is space. And they need to be able to can avoid desiccation, so having a shell or being able to have like a really strong muscular foot, not a real foot, but a foot that maybe like a snail or a mollusk would have to attach themselves and like secure, like suction their shell to the substrate. And the other thing is they also don't want to get washed away. So they need to have a really strong ability to attach, or maybe like a seaweed and have like a hold fast on it as part of your macroalgae group. All right, things to notice. Lower shore, this one is going to be submerged most of the time, except for your low spring tides. Middle shore, you got that half and half, and then upper shore is most exposed. You're going to find a lot of shells here, but probably not a scallop, because scallops like Pac-Man through the water, but that's my go-to shell. And if you compare the data, your average temperature, where there's most exposure, your temperature is highest, and then it goes down, and then at the lower shore where it's going to be submerged most of the time, it's the lowest. Explain why the average temperature of the rock pool increases with height above the low tide level. And if you're thinking that it's the sun, good job. Or the hot air, they're the most exposed. They are the most exposed and they stay exposed the longest. So like as say like your tide started right here, right? Here's some high tide. Well, upper shore is going to be exposed a bit, and then it goes down, and then further down, and now middle shore is exposed, and now is your low tide, and then it comes back up. Middle shore and upper shore exposed, covers the middle. Upper shore is still exposed. Upper shore has been exposed the longest, so it has the most duration out of the water. The upper shore or the higher shore is exposed to sunlight or the atmosphere. That's one mark. The other one is about the duration for a longer time, longer than all the other ones. Another good one. This one jumps back to 1.2, section 1.2, and yeah, it's all about salinity, temperature, and its effect on gas solubility. Describe how, and give a reason, why the oxygen concentration will be different between rock pools in the different regions of the shore. And so again, this is in your textbook. We had notes on this. If you were my student, you did. And if you didn't, that means you didn't do it. In any zone, there could be a rock pool, right? So like where water just remains after the tide has gone out, obviously down here in the lower shore, and then in the upper shore as well. You can have rock pools. So the longer that there's exposure to the atmosphere, to the sun, you're going to have a higher temperature in the rock pool. And if temperature is going up, that means that you won't have as good gas solubility. Gas is not very soluble in warm water. And I would always say to my students, we don't drink warm soda. Anything that's carbonated, we keep cold because it allows for higher gas solubility. Not only that, if temperature is going up in the rock pool, you have fresh water evaporating, and that's going to increase salinity. And if salinity is high, then you're going to have low gas solubility or low amounts of oxygen in there. You just don't have enough space for the oxygen to stay. Okay, so describe how the oxygen concentration will differ. So describe as what, how is that going to be different? And you need to explain your reason for that between different regions. Okay, and you can have the reverse argument for this, but I'm going to be talking about the upper shore. In the upper shore, there will be less oxygen. Or the reverse argument, in the lower shore, there will be more oxygen. So this is the how, and then the why. A couple reasons. You're going to have higher temperatures. And on Monday, we're going to write temperature, not temp. And this makes O2 less soluble. Another reason, you're not having like waves crashing in the upper shore. When waves are crashing in, they're replenishing that area and those rock pools, even just splashing in there. It's replenishing it with colder water from the ocean, so that it's going to be increasing its gas solubility, and just water that already has gases dissolved in it. Gases get dissolved in the ocean through photosynthesis, also through interaction with the atmosphere, waves. And within that salinity context too, real quick, if the salinity is high, and it'd be higher than what the ocean was, because that's the water that was remaining in the rock pools, what was coming from the ocean, it's going to be higher than that if it's just been baking in the sun during low tide. So if you have the ocean splashing water in again, then you're going to kind of be bringing down the salinity back to where it originally was, which again will allow then for more gas solubility because the salinity is not going to be as high. All right. And there's less water exchange or mixing with the ocean. Again, or the reverse argument, if you're talking about in the lower shore, you would say there's more water exchange or there's more mixing in the ocean. All right, then our evaporation thought. More evaporation in the higher rock pools or the upper rock pools. Which will increase salinity, which again decreases oxygen solubility. State, so just one or two word answers. Two, only two. If you write three, they're only going to read the first two. If you write an answer right here and comma, and then you put another one right here, and then another one on line 2, this is your 1, this is your 2, and this is your 3, they're not going to read that. Even if 1 and 2 on these first lines are, one is correct, number 2 is incorrect, and then what you actually put on this second line, that would be your third, is correct. It doesn't matter. It's just the first two things that you write. So you don't need to write more than 2, it won't be graded. 2, biotic, so living factors that affect the distribution or the zonation of organisms in the lower rock pool. So organisms down here, what's going to affect their distribution? It's honestly going to be what's going to affect anything biotically. It's not going to be availability of mates. They're twice a day, they're trying not to die with the tides. It's going to be food availability, and they're not really going to be mating. They're honestly going to release sperm and egg into the water. Food availability is a biotic versus like temperature, attachment to a substrate, type of substrate, oxygen amount, pH, predation. So they don't want to get eaten, but they also want to have food. And a lovely answer that can go with pretty much any biotic type question, disease. I always think it's like a cop-out answer, but it works pretty well in the right biotic situations. Suggest 2 adaptations that rocky shore organisms have to high wave action. And the suggest command word really implies that you may have not covered this in the syllabus, but apply your knowledge to it. You should have covered this in the syllabus. This is their need for attachment. So 2 adaptations. They're going to have strong or thick shells. And so that will avoid any physical abrasiveness or physical impact of the waves. A strong attachment. This is where you can bring in like the muscular foot. The keyhole limpet. Here's its shell. And it can bring its soft body tissue. There's a smile. It can bring its soft body tissue back into that shell and essentially just anchor on. An ability to return, and this is a very specific answer, to a home scar. Home scars are something that limpets can create. They look like little helmets on a rocky shore. And then a home scar is like an indentation that they can make over time that's like in a rock. And they know where they go back to. Like they go back to their home scar on top of it. And in class, we did a graph on the distance they moved, I believe. No, it was a percentage. Ability to hide in crevices or under rocks. Ability to trap, enclose water in a shell to avoid desiccation. For the marine organisms, flexible fronds of seaweeds. I'm sure you've seen them like under the water. There's a lot of waves and okay. I don't hate it. I don't hate it. I don't hate it. I mean, you see them just like going back and forth and then back again. So they have to be able to move a lot. They can't be like resisting the water. And that would be to avoid damage. I know there was something about a hold fast. It goes with the strong attachment. Muscular foot or a hold fast. Hold fast are what we would refer to as roots on a macroalgae. Oh, this is probably going to look more like mangrove prop roots. I'll try not to. Just lovely job. And they also have these air bladders, nematocysts, and that helps keep them floating, gas bladders. The roots are not for mineral absorption. It is just to anchor them into a substrate and to attach themselves to a substrate. Yeah, okay. Almost done with that first section, and then we just got the last pages. Love a fill in the blank. If you can get Cambridge to get you a fill in the blank, that's awesome. It's so easy. Fertilizers used to grow crops in fields contain elements nitrogen and phosphorus. And those are also two of the most limiting nutrients in the ocean, which is why, and in intertidal areas, and that's why it can cause big algal blooms. These can be washed into the ocean via runoff. This is water containing, or runoff that contains dissolved solids. State one biological molecule that contains both elements. It's not going to be carbohydrates. And if you're unsure, think about glucose. You should know glucose is C6H12O6. It's a carbohydrate, it's a sugar. Oses and carbohydrates are synonyms. They end in ose. Ose, carbohydrate, sugar. Sugars end in ose, carbohydrates end in ose because sugar and carbohydrate are the same thing. But there's no nitrogen, there's no phosphorus in that. Lipids, same thing, and a little bit of O. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just a little bit of oxygen. There's none in there. This is going to be a protein. Could also then say amino acid, which is its monomer. Amino acids make proteins, but you could also say nucleic acids. DNA, RNA. ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine it's an amino group, it has nitrogen in it. All right, to complete the sentence, nitrogen is essential to organisms to make blank, and you might be like, what goes in there? Keep reading, which are required for cell repair and growth. This is for protein. Now, it would be nucleic acid if it said nitrogen is essential for organisms to make blank, which are required for cell replication, DNA, then it could definitely be nucleic acids. Phosphorus and blank are essential nutrients in the production of bones for marine vertebrates. Bone is calcium phosphate. And I think there's like maybe a -3. I don't know. I don't know because it is not demanded to know. Phosphorus and calcium. Bones are calcium phosphate. Calcium carbonate is shells and corals. Last short answer. Looking at a pyramid of biomass, bio is life, mass is stuff. So this is like the living tissue, things that you can actually eat. What's not biomass are bones, teeth, hair, fur, feathers. All right. Suggest how the bars on the pyramid would change over time following the input of fertilizer from runoff. Explain your suggestion. If this had a harmful algal bloom, we would need to answer it differently than we're going to. The harmful algal bloom, or an HAB, could produce something like cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. And this is all in the textbook in section 3.2. And for my students, it was the very last slide of those 3.2 notes. If it was specifically a harmful algal bloom, I'm only saying this because I'm paranoid about this question, that you could get one like this. If it's a harmful algal bloom or cyanobacteria, those produce a toxin, and which is why it's so devastating ecologically. We have manatees die and thousands of fish die. It produces a toxin, or like a neurotoxin even, and the fish and organisms in the water avoid eating it. So if it's a harmful algal bloom or reference to cyanobacteria, it's a little tricky. You're going to have a very big producer trophic level, and you will not see the rest of them increase at all. But this question does not feed itself to that. This is just a straight up algae bloom, doesn't have to be harmful, and it's not producing any toxin. So fertilizers are inorganic substances, so they have to be synthesized into something organic or living, and that's a plant's job. And then we can pass it up the food web or trophic levels. Animals don't eat fertilizers. We don't drink fertilizer shakes if we want to build more protein. We have to either eat a plant or eat something that has eaten a plant. We don't do plant magic. All right, so how would the bars change, and explain your answer? So the lowest bar, or the producer trophic level, or algae, would increase or get wider, longer. And then your explanation, fertilizers allow for more growth of algae or of producers. All right, but this question says bars on the pyramid, so not just your producer. Let's talk about the rest. All right, this is not a harmful algal bloom. This is a straight up, there's some algae. It doesn't say harmful, and it doesn't say that there's a toxin developed. Okay, the extra organic material. Organic material is a fancy way to say food, but it's not really collegiate enough to say the extra food. You say the extra organic material, or biomass, living stuff, or glucose, nutrients. Would cause the, let's see, bars of higher trophic, TL, trophic level organisms. So literally like the other trophic level. To increase or get wider. And when I say the extra organic material, only underlining it just to bring reference to it, this is from the algae doing photosynthesis. Okay, and the last mark on this then, the extra organic material, biomass nutrients could cause the bars of higher trophic level organisms to increase or get wider. Why would this happen? Due to the producers, the algae, receiving excess nutrients. And let me be honest, I don't like the order of this. I'd probably put it right here. It's not that it's wrong. Just for me, it doesn't mentally flow the way I would want it to. It's not that it's wrong. They all work. So the way I would want it would be the lowest bar, the producer trophic level, or algae. Those slashes mean this or that would increase or get wider. Fertilizers allow for more growth of algae. The producers or the algae are receiving excess nutrients. And the extra organic material or biomass or nutrients from the algae doing photosynthesis would cause the bars of higher trophic level organisms to increase or get wider. So something about the algae is benefiting, everybody benefits. The end. Yay. Describe the main structural features of a coral polyp and state the function of each feature. You may include a labeled diagram. And then what we got, 2 left. Biodiversity. Oh, 3 left, 4. 3 left. Muddy shore and our gradients. Let's go. Okay. In my review today, we nailed this question down. There, of course, could be a chance that this question gets asked again. It is the only organism out of all of the key organisms that you would need to know the functions for of their anatomy. So though this question could be intimidating because it takes up a whole page and don't we hate to see it, but it's also 10 marks. So it's like 18% of the grade out of a 75-mark test. This is glorified vocab, but the fact that you could include label diagrams, I highly recommend. If you can't think of the way that a coral anatomy looks, spend 12 minutes learning that. And that's pretty much about how long it took my group of students to do that today. Look at it, try it. You're not going to get it right the first time, for sure not. And then let yourself look at that same simple picture again, and then draw from your memory again, and label areas. And like add, like when I say draw from your memory, add the additions that you didn't already have, and then label those areas based on what you're not able to label. Maybe it's because you didn't include that structure in your quick sketch. But you can do this right on the paper, or you could always just list out their structures, but I'm a very visual person, so I would need to see it. So they sit in something that's a cup. Very displeased how that started. All right, so we're going to draw a cup. We also want to leave space for labeling. All right, this is a cup. And I'm going to draw something and then I'm going to immediately get rid of it. But if you imagine like this is the handle, it's a cup. It's a cup, but it's not. It's going to be holding our coral. Okay, it's going to attach to a hard substrate. All right. And then the top. Outside his tentacles. It's not my best, but it's also definitely not my worst. Dang it. I'm just doing the most right now. Isn't she lovely? All right. This is not a biological drawing by any means. They did say you could include diagrams. You don't have to. So if you wanted to use a pen, sure, you can use a pen and you can make a mistake and it's not that big of a deal. They're not looking for you to do a skill here. They're testing content knowledge. All right, they have tentacles. Tentacles obviously are going to be for feeding. So they need a mouth as well. There's my mouth. And then inside of that mouth, we go to a very simple structure. They're going to have just the stomach. Stomach is for digesting food, organic material, digesting organic material or biomass, little walls of the stomach. That does not need to be included. That's good for me. All right, and then some smaller details is that we need to consider what's on the outside. So you don't have to include zooxanthellae, although maybe if you did, you could get a mark. I don't know. It is not on the original mark scheme, and whatever. But do it. Better to put something that you know is legit than leave it blank. So on the outside of the tissues, you have very small, microscopic nematocysts, and those are the harpoon-like, thread-like stinging cells, and it's for capturing prey. Let's go. All right. So I'm going to start from the bottom and move up. And this is just glorified vocab. It's worth practicing because it's easy marks. Will you get the same exact question again this year? I don't know. Could you? Absolutely you could. Would it be 10 marks? I don't know. All right. So the bottom, basal plate. And remember the line that you're drawing needs to touch the structure that you're labeling. And I'm just underlining it just for visual for you guys so you can see the main parts. Basal plate, this is the basal bottom of the stony cup. It anchors polyps to the hard substrate. It's weird, anchor polyps to the substrate, great. And then we have this area in the middle. It's right here. This is called the theca. These are the walls of the stony cup. You don't have to say stony. I can't think of a way just to, other than just practice, to remember that theca is the wall. But if it was like the thick theca walls, they're not thick. They're actually very thin because it allows for like straight up gas diffusion. They don't have any sort of ventilation structure like gills or lungs or anything like that. Okay, just statements, just things I'm saying. And then this entirety of this, the bottom of the cup right here, that's going to connect to this, to the hard substrate. And then the walls of it, this whole thing there is called the calyx. And this is the stony cup that they sit in. This is like the calyx is the stony cup essentially. Okay, and then maybe like, I don't know. That's a terrible bracket. There we go. And I'm still going to write horizontally, because don't expect people to be turning your paper in all sort of directions. Your lines can go in different directions, but not your words. Moving up. That's a stony cup that they sit in. Keep moving up. All right, these are tentacles. And this is to capture prey. With nematocysts. And I'll just do that one right now. Nematocysts. Nematocysts. All Cnidarians in phylum Cnidaria spelled like this. Oh no. How did I spell it the other day? I spelled it wrong. Cnidaria. I just pronounced it wrong. Anyways, they all have these stinging cells. So jellyfish, corals, anemones, nematocysts. These are their stinging cells. Also for protection. Almost done. All right, they got a mouth. This is for ingesting prey, but it's also for waste removal. They have one hole in, that same hole is for out. And then the last thing, so if they're going to eat something, we have to move it down to their stomach. Stomach, this is to digest prey. All right, there she is. It doesn't have to be a biological drawing. It doesn't be a perfect drawing. I think it's easiest to think of this in your head and then start labeling the parts. With 10 marks, that's a big question, but you have more, and sorry, everything that I put a bullet point by is a mark, and also identifying the structure. So the structural names are also a mark. And their functions. You don't have to do a picture, but I find it's much easier to give yourself a picture and then build off of it. So there's more than 10 marks available here. Okay, then the last video that I did, we talked about corals in terms of their abiotic importance. And so now this is going to be much more of a biotic importance. Biodiversity of a healthy tropical coral reef is very high. Discuss, so just talk out, the importance of the local economy. I'm just going to talk about money, of maintaining high biodiversity on tropical coral reefs. So this is definitely going to be one that we can talk about giving a definition with. When in doubt, give a definition. And the definition is going to be the three different ways to define biodiversity or to identify biodiversity. Okay, we can start with that. So the definitions. You have genetic diversity. And this is a measure of the variety of genes in a species. One second. Okay. Sorry, back. We have species diversity. Sorry, I'll write it out for you. Species diversity. This is the number of different um, species and their abundance. So not just like, oh, there's a lot of different species in an area, but there's a lot of those species and there's a lot of that. Like there's a lot of different species, but then there's a lot in their populations as well. We wouldn't say there's a lot of different species if you had like only one of each kind. You would want there to be an abundance of them. And the last one is ecological diversity. And this is a measure of the variety of ecosystems locally or regionally and globally. All right. So talking about local economy, things that they give for us, we got food. Of course, we have shoreline protection from erosion and always climate control. These are the definitions. Okay, so biodiversity. And these are questions definitely worthwhile to go over because they're very easy. Attracts tourists. If you're an ACE environmental, you could definitely piggyback on some of these for sure. All right. Harvesting, so fishing, taking them out. Provides food sources. Which can increase employment for locals. There. Okay, if locals are coming there spending money because, not locals, if tourists are coming there spending their money, there's good restaurants, there's good food sources, there's, some ecotourism going on and things they can do in the environment. People will be hired, people that are local will be hired to be able to facilitate those different services, and people will be spending money. So there will be an increase in income, increases in taxes paid to that area, which taxes might sound like a bad thing, but when you're a tourist paying taxes somewhere, that area immediately benefits from your taxes. And that's why in Florida we have so many toll roads. The toll roads really prevent us from having to pay state income taxes. But anyways, which can increase income or taxes, which will improve or can improve if it's not corrupt infrastructure. Infra is like this, the streets, transportation, roadways, sidewalks. It's all of the in between points within an area. This is piping. This is for gas pipes, water lines. Having like community accessible areas. That would be like your infrastructure. For local people, that will be the context they put it in. Okay, that's cool for my food and money. Next area, again, it's worth going over even though you're definitely past 6, because you could have another biodiversity question on Monday and they're easy marks. And so just to see how easy they are, you should definitely go through and write them. Your brain will remember it better than just hearing it. Okay, we're going to talk about the climate control again. Zoe, so, and other producers, There are other producers in a coral reef area, but specifically within the coral, it's zooxanthellae. Absorb CO2. All right, and this is when they do photosynthesis. I wish this would just guess the word for me. During photosynthesis, and this will decrease the effects of global warming. You could also say, could it decrease the enhanced greenhouse effect? If you're familiar with it, I know in environmental, you need to cover it. In A-level marine, that's when they have the definition for the enhanced greenhouse effect. And this can, again, the decreasing of CO2 can also decrease ocean acidification, which prevents coral erosion, or you can talk about it, coral erosion and then causing a biodiversity loss. You can go down the rabbit hole with that a little bit if you wanted. Okay, and that's climate control. So we richly just have coastline protection left. Corals decrease wave energy, or wave strength, wave height, wave speed. Which prevents shoreline erosion. And this will save money by not having to invest in artificial reefs and or seawalls. Seawalls are structures that are put up to try and minimize erosion. They are expensive. And insurance companies, if you're living somewhere there, know that you're going to put up a seawall. It's a lot of money and it's going to get eroded. Like it's not forever. They never last forever. Seawalls cost in Florida around 500 to, I just looked it up, $500 to $1,200 per foot, like lengthwise, per linear foot. So an average residential project, it costs $15,000 to $60,000. That's a lot. But they're not going to they're not going to last forever, and they're also a little unsightly. They're a little unattractive, which is a big question, isn't she? And these aren't like the only type answers. Like if you got more specific things to go into, you want to talk about, you know, climate control maybe affecting enzymes, if maybe you're a little bit better within the biological, like microbiological, cellular biological aspects, go for it. Talking about the shoreline protection, if you have some more details to add to it, add some more details to it. But it's for local economy. Yes. Yes. Okay. I know, honestly, and now that I had my just saying that out loud, I know this will prevent, again, within that shoreline protection, um, excess flooding. I'm just thinking about other mark schemes. During storms, which can damage crops or increase salinity in soil. Oh, that works. Okay. 2 more left, y'all. You can do this. Describe the role of weathering, erosion, and sedimentation in formation of a muddy shore. I had all my students practice this same question, and then I changed out muddy shore to delta. I changed out muddy shore to sandy shore. I changed it to rocky shore, just so they can get the same flow. That, honestly, the way you're answering isn't going to be any different. It's just the different aspects in those areas. And so with weathering, things we want to consider, giving a definition of these things. When in doubt, give a definition. When we're talking about shoreline formation, sometimes this question will say, how does erosion and sedimentation give rise to, which means the same thing. Like, how does it form? But we just got to be fancy and say, give rise to. When we're talking about forming of a muddy shore or any shoreline, for any shore, things you want to talk about. What is the slope like? Make sure we mention the slope, the sediment size or sizes. Muddy shores have the smallest sediment sizes, and the smallest specifically being silt. What's the wave action like? Wave action. What's the water movement? Is it constantly moving? Do you have high wave action? Or is the water still like it is in a muddy shore? And then a statement about the rate of erosion compared to sedimentation. So erosion is, we're essentially going to be thinking erosion is like how much wind and water are moving, predominantly water. Sedimentation is the opportunity for sediment to settle. They can't both be high. In a sandy shore, there are aspects of both, right? There is erosion from waves, and we can see that during storms for sure. There's also erosion in sand, with sand. If you've ever been to a sandy shoreline, and Florida is full of it, if it's ever been windy and you've been pelted in the face or the legs with sand, it kind of hurts. It starts to like bury your towel and bury your stuff. Obviously, there's erosion. That's wind erosion. It's moving sediment, which is what erosion is. But you can still dig in the sand. So something has to dominate. Your feet still can bury in the sand. The fact that there is a bunch of sand there means that sedimentation is dominating erosion. It is greater than erosion. Even though you do have waves, they're not as big as a rocky shore. All right, just saying that. So we're gonna start with our definitions and then our types. Remember, with weathering, you do have 3 types. COP is the acronym we thought of in class. There's chemical, organic, and then physical. And then for erosion, it's WIG. Water, wind, ice, and gravity. On a muddy shore is flat. And then you just have some standing water only at high tide. Some standing water. That's about it. Period. Small sediment size. Gravity is not going to be an aspect in here that's going to bring any sort of sediment here. Like, where's it going to fall from? The sky? It's not. It's going to be through glacial methods or wind or water. Definition: weathering is the breakdown of rocks or sediments. In a muddy shore, it's not happening. The way that sediment got that small is because it was weathered at another location, but it's not currently experiencing any weathering. Sandy shores too. They have small sediments, not the smallest. They have small and coarse sands, but the way that it got to be that small was there was weathering. It's not happening at the sandy shore though. They were weathered and then they were eroded, and that is the order it needs to be in. You got to break it down before it gets moved away. You can't take the entirety of the boulder. You got to break the boulder down, weather it, and then erode it. Okay, and so we're going to say through chemical, organic, or physical means. Physical weathering is going to be like somebody standing on it, breaking it. Something too heavy on a rock, breaking it. Chemical would be the influence of oxygen or water within a rock. It could be a little bit of both. It could be the repeated freezing and thawing and then it's cracking and causing a lot of fractures in the rock. So you could have physical. Um, you could have the chemical, like sorry, Alexa's trying to tell me something, but oxygen and water influencing the rock, and then it physically gets broken. So maybe something heavy's on it. Organic would be something that's alive is forcing it to break. So maybe some tree roots. Alexa's reminding me to do the laundry. Gosh. Erosion is the movement of sediment by wind, water, ice or glacial to the ocean. And yeah, so this question didn't have gravity on there because, and this is my thought, right? I don't write the mark schemes. My thought is gravity isn't on here because gravity wouldn't be influencing a muddy shore. It's not, nothing's going to be falling into the muddy shore because muddy shore's already flat. There's really nothing above it. Like the low country in South Carolina, like Murrells Inlet, flat. The entirety of Florida, flat. Okay, ready? Muddy shores have flat or no slope. So flat slopes with dot 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 dot. Actually, I'll put it on the next mark. Sorry. With low water movement. Okay. Or no wave action. If there was waves, then a muddy shore wouldn't be full of mud. It would, like, the water would be very thick and dark, but the water movement is so minimal that those, even those smallest sediments are able to settle out of solution and start depositing, or they're a very high deposition. They're depositing on top of themselves because the water is so still. Okay. The sediment size is the smallest. Silt. And then the low wave action, again, slow water, no, very minimal water movement, allows small, and I think it'd be better if I said silt. I'm sorry, I'm almost done, I promise. I've just been doing like literally test review too long today. Around silts to deposit or settle out of solution, or settle out of suspension. But honestly, it's better if you say it allows them to deposit, because that should be a vocab word for you, deposition. And then the rate. The rate. Greater than, that's excessive. That actually is excessive. There we go. Greater than the rate of erosion, which means sediment is settling, depositing on itself more than it is being moved. Erosion is the movement of sediment. Sedimentation is the deposition of sediment. Deposition is the settling of sediment. Deposition and sedimentation are really similar definitions. And then weathering has to happen first no matter what. So whether it was, 100,000, 300,000 years ago, weathering is the breaking down of rocks, the breaking down of sediments. Erosion moves it. Deposition or sedimentation allows it to settle. And that's pretty much all done by the lack of water action, lack of water moving. A rocky shore is the complete opposite of this. A rocky shore can have a very steep slope. A rocky shore has boulders and a variety of different size sediments. They do have small sediments. You don't see them because the water is so rough, the wave action is so high, and there's constant water moving. We have a lot of tidal influence and water currents, and there's so much water moving constantly that those small sediments don't get to settle out of solution, and they stay suspended. Goodness gracious! All right, guys, and the last one is big. Okay, let's persevere. We're so close to being done. Describe how. And I told my students too, like, there's nothing wrong with answering a describe question with explains. So there's nothing wrong with if you are, giving the descriptions and you're also giving a reason behind it. You're either going to get the mark or they're going to be like, oh, we don't need all that information. You don't get the mark. You probably get the mark. It is incorrect though if it says explain how and you didn't go into reasons why or explanations why, and instead you just said the what, right? You just describe it. You just described what it was, what was happening. And you didn't explain. If it asked you to explain, then you can't get all the marks possible most of the time. How temperature and salinity. So you have two different things we need to talk about. And salinity gradients form in the seawater and how mixing can occur. Now, the good thing is, whatever you're talking about with mixing, the mixing doesn't change. If they're talking about salt mixing or temperature gradients mixing, it doesn't matter. Microplastics in the ocean mixing, it doesn't matter. If you're mixing water, you're mixing whatever's inside of it. So the mixing reasons will never change at all, not at all. And when they say gradients, that makes you, I know that's like a questionable thing. They're talking about the layers of the ocean. And now luckily you only have 3. I'm not talking about 5.1, the open ocean and the actual different layers, but when we're talking about density layers, there's really only 3. Not in terms of light penetration, like your epipelagic, mesopelagic, not that. This is different. So at the bottom, I'm going to draw this out for you, okay? So for temperature, things to consider is the thermocline and what that looks like. Okay, degrees Celsius, and we'll have 0 here, and then a nice average, and I'm going to erase the degrees Celsius because now she's in my way. Degrees Celsius, and I'm going to like finish at like 28. All right, and then obviously this is depth in meters. At the surface, water is warm because it has a lot of sunlight penetration and solar radiation. Sorry, not just solar radiation, but thermal radiation, heat radiation. And that doesn't go too far. So then you see a very big, drastic, great decrease in temperature with depth. And then you have a slow fall towards the bottom. The temperature cannot hit this y-axis. It cannot decrease to the y-axis and touch it, because that would mean that then the water is 0 degrees Celsius, which means it's frozen, which means it would go to ice at the top, but it's not. Hopefully it doesn't look like this. These lines are never straight across. That wouldn't make sense. It cannot be like that. There's never a depth that necessarily has a temperature here and here and here. It's not like that. It decreases with depth. So make sure that your line shows a decrease. And the rate of decrease matters. It can't take, thousands of meters for it to decrease. You can't have something like this. In case you have to draw a thermocline, it can't be like this. I mean, because then what? Shoot, you just did like the whole water column, the whole middle. You're just getting colder and colder. It's an abrupt decrease. Oh, okay. And just like we would do in class, I will identify the thermocline. Actually, not even quite there. It's a little bit more. Okay, so pretty much right here, and we would put a ruler up against this. This is the layer, the boundary, the column, or the area of water with the greatest change in temperature with depth, where those pink lines are. So in this area, you're going to have a very abrupt change in temperature. And then once you're done with that temperature change, you just have a slow fall towards the bottom. And so the layers, and then we'll start writing. The layers that we identify is one, the surface layer. So we're going to describe it. What is it like? Why is it like that? And why does that water stay at the surface? It's not because the sun's there. Water doesn't get a choice in where it goes and if it wants to go to the sun or not. The reason why it's there is all density based. Two, talk about your thermocline and what's happening there. And then three, what happens towards the bottom. And yeah, we did this like first semester, but remember I would give you guys draw a sun, talk about, and so you just could actually imagine that there was real things going on there. All right, so we're going to do the temperature one, and then we can talk about salinity. This question can get intimidating if you're like temperature and salinity gradients. You talk about two different things. All right, at the surface, or you could say the epipelagic layer. Pelagic means open ocean. Water is warm. Water is heated. Warm water floats due to low density. Okay, so this is what is it like? And I said we were going to answer it like it was an explain. This is like the why. So what is it? What is it like? And then why does it stay there? It's about low density. That is why. Okay, below this layer. And we're going to do the thermocline definition because you could be asked to recall it, so you might as well practice it on this. Thermocline, halocline, and pycnocline are all the same definition with the exception of one word. It's either temperature, salinity, or density. Everything else flows. Below this layer is the region, or you could say the column, or the area or boundary of water with the greatest change in temperature. This is the thermocline. Okay, so this is the second layer. Here's the first. Okay, and then why does that happen? Thermal, so it's the heat, radiation, or thermal energy doesn't penetrate far or deep, I don't like saying far, deep into the ocean. All right, and then this specific answer, they like took examples, which is weird, especially for describe and it's not explained, but either way, they took examples. Don't stress yourself over having these examples. There'll be more than enough things you can write about to get all 7, but I'm going to include it anyway. So we would say above thermocline, temp is about 20 degrees Celsius. Below the thermocline, temp is about 4 degrees Celsius. And then they say in the deep ocean, or at the seabed, temp is about 1 degree Celsius. I mean, literally, please don't stress yourself over that. There's plenty more to write about. And then the last thing we can say is as depth increases, temperature decreases. You don't need to say why. You don't need to say because it increases in density, so it's going to sink. You don't need to say that because you already wrote about the density statement right here. So as long as you've already introduced that idea, then you don't have to say it both ways. It's already implied. Okay, there and there. So here's essentially the layer 3. Here's layer 2, and this is layer 1. Make sure when you say as depth increases, temperature decreases, that way. It's not temperature causing the ocean depth to change. It's the reason is it's so cold at the bottom of the ocean, it gets colder with depth is because it's so deep. The further you go, the further you are away from like solar radiation or like thermal radiation. If you say temperature decreases, then depth will do something, that doesn't make sense. That's like saying if there's a seasonal change or it becomes winter and the ocean gets colder, like now the oceans are shallower, it's not as deep anymore. But watch how you say it so you're not saying that something controls the other. The depth is in charge. Okay, my gosh. All right, so we have to do the halocline. Then we're done. This is measured in parts per 1,000, or it looks like this. And we can put 0 here because that's the right thing to do. And give a little break in the graph because we're only going to be really considering 35 parts per 1,000 and maybe only up to like a 37 maybe. There's not a big range. So at the surface, you can have some precipitation, some precipitation, which will dilute the water. You could also have fresh water runoff. You could also have melting of sea ice, and that could dilute it. And then that diluted water doesn't go too far, and so we increase abruptly, and then we have a slow increase towards the, look at me go. Then we have a slow increase towards the seabed because salts sink and salts have mass. And the layers that we're going to form now. We have a layer right, not there, it's a little bit higher, layer right here. I'm not loving that. Okay, I'm fine with it. I'm fine with it there. There's layer 1. Okay, layer 2. This is your halocline. And that's a ridiculous 3, layer 3. And so this whole area right here is the layer, boundary, or column of water with the greatest change in salinity with depth. Those matter because those keep the ocean stratified. They keep surface water up at the top, and then they keep deep water at the bottom. There are things that will cause its mixing, and we will have to include that towards the end. Do what you need with these pictures because I'm going to erase them so I can finish out the rest of this question. Like you couldn't just go back and rewind it. Let's do it. At the surface, we gotta talk about the layers. The water can be diluted. And I'm only answering for like a traditional temperate ocean, not for the tropics. By precipitation, melting sea ice, freshwater runoff, and all that jazz. Less saline water floats due to lower density. There's my surface. There's number 1. Layer 2. Below the surface is the layer, boundary, column, or area of water with the greatest change in salinity with depth, and this is called the halocline. Not pleased, halocline. Goodness gracious. All right, almost done. Okay. As depth increases, salinity increases. You don't need to say why. You already did. You already said that less saline water will float because it is low density. So if salinity is increasing, then it's going to sink because it's higher density. All right, and make sure this is depth controlling it, not salinity controlling it. It's not saying if the ocean gets a little bit saltier, has more dissolved solids, then the depth of the oceans altogether will change. That doesn't make sense. And this is that 3. Last thing. Let's go. Mixing. It does not matter if, again, you're talking about temperature, salinity, or toxins or plastics. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Mixing. And you'll want to mention like mixing occurs by, or you could do like a bracket off on the side and label it all mixing. That's also acceptable. But don't just like vomit out words. Just introduce it. Strong winds. I wouldn't just say winds. Like daily winds, whoop-de-doo. But like strong winds can cause mixing. Turbulence. Water currents. Upwelling, movement of cold, nutrient-rich water from the seabed to the surface. It doesn't happen during El Nino. And then the last one is seasonal. Changes in temperature, like decreasing the temp at the surface, will cause the surface to sink. Holy cow. If you stayed with me this whole time, thank you so much. It's worth it. And soon it will all be over. Good luck on your test, and thank you.